Hello, everybody, and welcome to Finding the Right Publisher for Your First Book. I'm Kathy Hanneback, founder and CEO of Ideas on Fire, the academic editing and indexing agency that helps interdisciplinary scholars turn brilliant ideas into publishable, often field-shaping books. I'm really thrilled to kick off our first book publishing series with this session today. This is a six-part series that walks you through every stage of the first book journey, from proposal to publication and beyond. And so across these sessions, I'll be joined by acquisitions editors, editorial directors, production editors, and marketing directors from more than a dozen leading university presses, including the lovely folks who are here today, who I will introduce in a minute. We're here to demystify the first book publishing process and share strategies to help you succeed. At Ideas on Fire, we've helped hundreds of scholars refine their manuscripts, strengthen their arguments, and ultimately bring their books into the world. And we know how much thought and care goes into first books in particular, and we really love helping folks navigate that process. If you have questions for our speakers during this webinar, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit those, and we'll have some time at the end of our session to get through some of those. Our fabulous speakers here today include Don Durante, editorial director of the University of North Carolina Press, Dominique Moore, senior acquisitions editor at the University of Illinois Press, and Mike Bacom, acquisitions editor at the University of Washington Press. Tech support is provided by Ideas on Fire's wonderful editorial director, Rachel Fudge, who I think some of you already know, and she'll also be in the chat. So without further ado, let me do this. To get us started, I would love to hear from our speakers. What strategies do you recommend to first-time authors for researching potential scholarly presses and then assessing which ones might be the best fit for their book?
I think it's a great idea to talk to editors at conferences and talk to your peers and look at books that have been published recently by the different presses that you, or look at books that you really love and figure out where they're coming out of. I will say, like, recently is important there because something that was published even 5 years ago could not be what the press is necessarily emphasizing in their editorial program in the next 5 years, right? So you really talking to editors at conferences and talking to your peers will really help you get a sense of what they're looking for now. So that's a good starting point.
A piece of advice I would add on to that, excuse me for those who might hear my little multi-poo in the back barking, but what I would recommend in addition to that is for folks who are on the conference circuit and do attend meetings in the space in their field to go take a look by the exhibit hall. And I would say not just look at which presses are at that particular meeting, but see the trends of what meetings you consistently see the same editors at or the same presses at, because it lets you know a little bit to Mike's point about an investment in the field that any individual press might have. They are not free to have these exhibit spaces and these booths. And so it does let you know something about where a press is allocating its resources. And that can be a really good and useful tool as you're thinking about what presses again are in a field and have a commitment to staying there.
I think those are great suggestions. And what I'd add is that a lot of university presses have been upping their game on social media, especially as we're chasing the proliferation of platforms with the transitions at Twitter. And so a good way to get a really the information about what presses are doing kind of fed to you is following on places like Instagram and Blue Sky. And then you can also get a feel for how a press might be supporting their authors out in the world and things like that. And I think, Mike made a really good point about making sure to think about what presses are recently doing. And one of the things I like to mention to authors is also if you get reached out to, if an editor reaches out to you and you're like, oh, I didn't have this press on my radar necessarily, it might be because they're in a building phase of a new area, which often means someone's devoting an extra amount of attention to that area. And so one of the things I like to say is the presses that you know and you're on your bookshelf are a great place to start, but don't sleep on a place where maybe didn't have it on your radar, but they're making a good pitch for you either. And in general, I think for all the answers we're going to give, I also do like to underscore there's like not one right way for all of this to go. Publishing is a process and there's some wrong things, but they usually are like, conventional social norms. So, if you have ideas about pursuing a publisher or an editorial relationship outside of what we discuss, like that's also fair game. Relationships are the core of what we do. So thinking about those as you navigate which publisher to submit to is a really good strategy at the core of it.
I also find that authors, when they're at conferences, when they see the kind of exhibition booths, when they see the acquisition editors, they often have questions about, am I supposed to go up and talk to people? What happens if I haven't already scheduled a meeting? Do they really want to talk to me if I don't have, a book proposal in hand? I get a lot of these kinds of questions. I'm curious how the three of you navigate that when you do want them to come up to you. You do want them to introduce themselves and kind of start that relationship there.
I love it when people come up to me at a conference. I don't personally prefer it when someone hands me a proposal because I will lose that paper in the flight back. I am not someone who loses a lot of things necessarily, but that is, I organize my workflow a lot with my inbox. So email is always great. But if we're at a conference, and I actually have started building a lot of time into my conference schedules that is like unscheduled time. So I'm not in back meetings to try and catch people like that who are just like, oh, by the way, like I couldn't reach out, or I heard you're working with one of my friends, so I wanted to stop by. So things like that.
Yeah, and I would say that I also love talking to people. It's, us editors are at the conference and we're trying to get your attention anyways. And sometimes it's okay if you browse the books too. But don't count on being able to talk to us for a long time at the conferences. Sometimes we'll have a great window where we can sit and talk to you for 10 minutes, but other times we got to like run to a meeting. So, be prepared to follow up later or just have a really quick conversation too.
To double up on that, because I would say I'm one of the editors. I don't historically take meetings at conferences. I really like the work at a conference to be serendipity. I always say the book know where it's supposed to be before any of us ever imagine that. And so to allow that process to happen, to let those kind of ad hoc conversations take place. And while I don't say that it is necessary to have an elevator pitch, I believe that every scholar is benefited by learning how to talk about their work in 30 seconds or less, is what I would say. There's a part of my job where I have to put together a 25-word rationale for folks who don't have any experience with the work, and having kind of really down cold what you're doing and why it matters and for who it's for. Is going to be the best way to evaluate folks. Sometimes I tell people, and people ask me, like, how do you start evaluating a project? I'm like, I'm evaluating it right now as you've been speaking to me about your work. And it's a lot easier to articulate work verbally than in writing. And it does, and it usually, right, there's always exceptions to that. But usually we have a pretty good mastery of how to communicate with folks since we talk so much just in our lives. And usually if there's a struggle to communicate the work to what I consider myself to be a generalist, so I don't know any field with any level of depth that scholars themselves do, but I am pretty, have a pretty overarching understanding of how the field works, and being able to make that digestible to me, like I said, in about 30 seconds or less is very important for you as you're thinking of someone. You are the best advocate for your work, and being able to pitch it and present it in that way can be very important.
Yeah, and I would say the pitch is not just for the pitch either. Like we want that in the book. Like you should be able to articulate what your project is about in, an accessible way, and make it compelling in a short period of time. So that's also good work for what's going to go in the manuscript too.
And what will go in the book proposal, presumably, like another document where you're pitching your project not only to the specific acquisitions editor, but to their colleagues, right? Because they have to sell it to other members at the press as well. So our next webinar in November is actually on book proposals, so we'll cover that in depth there. But I would love to hear from all of you. When you read a book proposal, hopefully not handed to you in person at a conference, but maybe emailed to you, how do you know that that book might be a good fit for your press? Or maybe conversely as well, what are some of the red flags or kind of signals that say that that book might not be a good match for your press, even if it could be a perfectly good match for a different one?
When I get a proposal, I am so interested in so many more things that cross my desk than I could possibly take on. So when I'm thinking about fit for the press, I'm mostly thinking about, are the press and the project equally suited to support one another? So if I'm reading a project and I'm so fascinated by it, and I'm like, dang, like this is not, we're not the best press for this. I feel like I have like a responsibility to also say like, I think you should try these other presses. So when I'm thinking about fit, I'm not just thinking about what will fit with the press. I'm thinking about, okay, is there a mutual relationship here? If I'm considering a project, say for a series, will the series will do as much to support this book and its like kind of curated list of titles as we can do to support the book? And, sometimes when you're growing a list, you tilt a little more in favor of the benefit to the press. And, sometimes you get projects and there's similarities across them. And you're like, can I absorb multiple books on a topic like this? Would it be good for the book itself? Would it be good for the press? And so wrestling with some of those things in terms of like the marketability, because I never do justice to a book if I acquire it, but we're not the best press to sell it. Because at the end of the day, it's not just sales, it's getting it in the hands of its likeliest readers in terms of dissemination. So if a press has a reputation for certain areas and a book feels like it could be an outlier for some of those based on my internal kind of perspective, because I know the backlist, I know what's in the pipeline, I can say kind of very responsibly, I don't think we're the best fit because we're not going to be the one to maximize getting the baby you've spent so many years writing and working on into the hands of its likeliest readers and audience.
I like to look at that bibliography or of a selected bibliography of a proposal. I like to see what text you are engaging with in the proposal itself. I always say you can see a proposal that it's a little ham-fisted to fit for the press. But it's like you really can't be in communication with our backlist and in the way that I think, to Dawn's point, is in best service to the work. And that is a lot of, I always say an acquisitions editor's primary skill is, I always say I'm trying to anticipate where a field is going and beat it there. That's kind of the game we're playing to develop a good backlist, because we really do plan on having a lifelong relationship with the scholarship and hopefully the author once it's all said and done. And so being able to see what type of text you see your book performing like. Do you have a lot of trade-like titles? Well, that might be nice, or academic trade titles, but that's not necessarily what we're looking for a first-time author. So we might have to have a conversation about expectations. What hands do you believe this work should be in? And can the press actually best serve that? And to Dawn's point, I always say sometimes the best thing I can do is just tell you that I'm probably not your editor. A lot of folks that work with me, they often hear, why have you talked to Duke? Have you talked to such and such? Because we get a feel for what every press has a personality, and being like, this book feels like a book for them. And I always try to send people on their way and be like, come back to me, if it doesn't work out there, because there is interest there, but it's not best that we do this now, especially if we're talking about a proposal. Then there's time to place it with the right press, I believe.
And just following from Dominica, yeah, echoing what both of you said about expectations, I really like to look at the audience section of a proposal and see if the author is being realistic, right? Like, first off, if they're being realistic, and also if if they see themselves appealing to the same audience that we would see the book appealing to. Because if they, you know, I don't want to shoehorn your project into our list if it's not a fit, right? So I think you want to be realistic about who you're going to reach and who the primary audience is. And that will help us determine a fit, and not just kind of see you trying to make it fall wherever we want to publish. So.
I often find that authors sometimes try to chase trends in publishing or worry that they should be. This is something that they should be tracking. I'm curious, given all of your kind of experiences at your individual presses that you've worked at, how do you think that first-time authors should try to balance what's currently hot and being talked about with long-term fit and relevance of their scholarship?
One of the first conversations I like to have with scholars, I tell them, for pie in the sky, 15 years out from now, where are you? What type of institution are you teaching at, and what are you working on, ideally? And then we reverse engineer where you should be published based off of that. I say, like I said, if you find yourself in an interdisciplinary field, but I know you want to be back in a more classical field, right? You want to be in the discipline of archaeology or anthropology. That's something that's important to know because that has implications for how you should write the book. It has implications on how that book should be reviewed, what type of scholars really need to vet this book and say it's ready to go out in the world for the career that you plan to have. And I think that, like I said, it's a long tail, it's a long game because of course we do kind of have to get it out. That's why I recommend start talking to editors early and often so you can start shaping this for yourself. Like I said, I start having conversations with folks once they've defended the dissertation idea. Because I do believe that the work can start back that early when we think about what type of writing career and do I see myself as a writer and how does everything contribute to that endeavor.
In acquisitions, we work on such glacial timelines that it's hard to like chase trends. I feel like it's like, oh, this is really hot right now, but what about in 3 years when your book comes out, right? Maybe an avalanche of books have already come out on this topic or whatever your type of analysis or things like that. But, you know, I think that chasing trends is really doing a disservice to your own work, right? Like you want to say what you want to say with conviction. And I think if you're chasing a trend, that's not you're oftentimes not coming from a place where you're saying what you really want to say and you're studying what you're excited to study and research, going to the archives and researching what you want to research, right, with energy. And people can see that on the page. So if you're part of a trend and you want to lean into it, fantastic, keep going. But like, I wouldn't be like, oh, something's hot over there, let's chase it. Or yeah, that's where I'll stop there.
And just to like double up on that, I think, well, I will say I saw that when it came to how people wanted to talk about COVID-19 in their scholarship right when it was happening. And I would almost say the hotter and splashier topic, you probably shouldn't say anything about it because A, you can't really give it the type of sophistication it deserves. And there is a lot of work that, in my opinion, kind of came out during that COVID bubble, or it's kind of still coming out right now, where it's a little half-cocked, the argumentation, because it happened a little too fast. And it's like, yeah, you're kind of talking about COVID, but not really, right? You're kind of just using these terms right at your end in your epilogue and trying to, again, reverse that you've really thought of this as a through line of thinking about the scholarship. So I usually do try to recommend against it, honestly.
One of the great things, one of the benefits of a university press is like we're in it for your book to stay in print for the long game. And it's one of the advantages I think sometimes people see if they're in a position to consider a commercial publisher versus university press publisher. Like, we're going to be thinking about your book in 10 years, and it's not the necessarily, it's our business model. And so it's just a bit of a different business model in other aspects of publishing. So more like front list after 2 years, there's like kind of, it's sold what it sold. But we're working really hard to make sure through peer review, this is standing up for the test of time, to getting you to where Dominique is at, where do you want to be in the next iteration of your career or in the long run? And those books staying in print, like it's kind of fascinating. I mean, I remember when, 9/11 happened, the Oxford University Press backlist of, Middle Eastern studies was like, there were reports about how it was selling. I used to be at University of Illinois Press before Dominique, and there's a book on P.T. Barnum. And when that Greatest Showman movie with Hugh Jackman came out, like it was an old book already, and it was like in the bestseller list. So if you write the book with like, I think Mike, you worded it like with your conviction and your expertise, and you can connect it to like presentist things if that is what makes it feel, if that those presentist things are what's going to make it last. But I often actually am coaching authors to get rid of like relatives, like saying currently or last year. Well, in 12 years, when people are still reading your book, because we're going to still be publishing it, that's out of date. So how can we kind of design it relevantly in the big picture, disciplinarily, but also like at the textual level?
Because a large trend for first time books, especially we do quite a few first time books, and oftentimes one might not necessarily do that second or third book, but a lot of scholars, that first book pops after book two kind of takes off, and you've got some heft in the field, and people go back. Like I said, a good first time book, I'm not expecting really to see a benefit from it for the first 5 years because I'm anticipating the scholar is going to be somewhere 5 years that makes people come back and rediscover their early work.
As those of us in publishing and in academia know, as you've pointed out, first books are often tenure books, and they kind of set up that next stage career in some pretty unique and dramatic fashions. And part of the way that that plays out in terms of publishing a first book is that tenure timelines are often very unforgiving. And of course, they're set by a university, not by an author per se, and not by the publisher, no matter how much we might want that to be different. I'm curious what tips you all have for authors in terms of balancing their author timelines and priorities, tenure related or otherwise, with publisher production timelines and priorities.
Taking as much time into your process as possible. That's why I say having conversations early. I love to give the example right at the kind of COVID kind of really happened at a pretty integral time in my own career. And I remember having to get people out the door. The archives are closed, so you've got to get rid of the photo and we've got to kind of put it out into the world. And so having that type of flexibility and not waiting till the last minute to kind of do some of these ticky-tacky things that when you start out, you don't really understand why they must be done. But kind of the publishing is this weird thing that you don't understand until you've done it. I would say I'm still trying to learn the beast that is publishing. But those types of things, again, that allow you to have the time to be flexible. And I think you can only do that by early exposure to the publishing process. Or it's the best way as well. So.
I mean, give yourself as much time as possible. We don't want you to be writing right up against the clock, and it's just extra stress. And production timelines, they can be really unpredictable, right? Especially with different presses. Like sometimes it can go quickly. Even if it goes quickly, that's a year, right? Until you have your book, right? So you have to figure out, what do they need? Do they need the book in their hands for your tenure file, or do they need it through press committee approval or through peer review or a contract, things like that. So you need to kind of figure out what exactly you need, and honestly build as much time in front of that as possible, a year, 18 months, just to give you wiggle room, because you might get peer reviews and be like, this is a really bad time for me to do this, right? So like, I want to circle back to this in 3 months, but if you're right up against the tenure timeline, then you might not be able to have that luxury. And on the same, on the same front, when you do have those spaces to work on your project, when you have lighter course loads, if you have, a quarter or a term where you're expected to be writing and researching, like you really have to take advantage of those times to finish as much as you can.
When I talk with authors, I talk about how what I really want out of our relationship is hopefully a collaboration. I'm getting the benefit of all their wisdom about their area, and I hopefully can be equally as generous in the wisdom I'm still learning every day about publishing and giving back. But I can't really be a very good collaborator if there's like kind of a set expectation or a goal in mind that I'm not like being like aware of. So I'm not trying to be nosy, but in order to be a team player, I find it really helpful if authors share some of their like particulars of their tenure timeline early on. I don't mind it in a cover letter for a proposal, in fact, and be like, because sometimes people have such a very urgent tenure timeline. I know we can't publish the book that quickly, and I will not waste their time. I will say, I can't do it. Like that's our production timeline alone, and we need peer review. So I can be more transparent. I can be more helpful with the more information I know. Another tip I give people is to get what your tenure committee expects in writing, because when those admins change, you don't want the expectation to change, because we are planning a lot around a certain set of timelines and circumstances. And some organizations are great and they have like a handbook and you can reference it. And sometimes it's a little less official. So that's one thing that I often am like, do you have it in writing? Okay, let's work around this. And both of my colleagues on this panel have already talked about timing, and how I always say it is, we can always slow the process down. We can never speed it up. We can never make a reviewer return their report sooner, but you can take as long as you need signing that contract if it turns out that it'd be more advantageous to you to sign it in the next academic year. Then, like, I don't love it when they just hang out on contracts unsigned, but I'm saying, like, we can manufacture more time if we need it, if we've not like hit the urgency. Like, we can slow things down if there's time to do it, but we can never find more time in the process just because of how it works.
I think that that element of the production takes the time that press's production takes is something that a lot of authors aren't aware of going in, and often, not often, I'd say sometimes run into issues with. And it could just be fixed by talking about that more explicitly earlier with their acquisitions editor. So I love that advice. I know that one of the things that first-time authors are often weighing in the process of finding the right publisher is kind of publisher prestige or reputation in the fields that they want to be a part of against more practical concerns, particularly for tenure books, where the stakes for these things are much higher in many ways than subsequent books. So I'd love to hear from all of you how you think authors should weigh the reputation of a press in their fields against factors like timeframes, as you were saying, communication practices, how the press's distribution or marketing techniques or reach, and let's be honest, likelihood of acceptance, because tenure books have a certain practicality to them. So kind of how do you think authors should weigh, this is a super hot press in my field and it would look amazing for me to be published with them, both to a tenure committee and to, the communities I care about, against, the more practical concerns of what it's like to actually work with the human beings and the processes at that press?
I mean, it's quite difficult, right? You have people telling you where you should be publishing, but you might want to publish somewhere else, or maybe the people, maybe where you want to publish isn't a right fit for you, right? So you have to think of other options. So I like to tell people to keep their options open, take care of their career. Like, I totally understand. Like, I talk to a lot of people who want to work with us and publish with us, but it's just like, hey, my chair, my committee won't see this as the most prestigious university. I'm like, hey, that's fine. We'll work on something together in the future. So, don't, and that's no problem for me. So like, don't worry about our feelings, right? It's totally fine if you have to go take care of yourself and publish where you feel like will support your career and your career path and where you want to go. Like Dominique mentioned earlier, like if you want to be seen more in this field versus a different field, and if that publisher is more known in that field, that's important too. So yeah, I think that there's maximize the practicality of it as far as how it's going to work for your career. And then after that, there's just a bunch of factors as far as like, well, what do I prioritize, right? Is it the marketing and distribution? Is it the design of it? Is it the editorial relationship? Is it the production timeline, right? All of these things come into play, and you usually can't get everything you want. So you kind of have to talk to different editors and figure out where you can compromise on what's most important to you.
You got to take care of like getting that promotion, getting your salary, like what all those material things that really add up over a career. I say, I have a lot more books left to acquire. You might have a lot more books left to publish. We'll work together someday if it doesn't work out for this one. And that doesn't even have to be like a material hurdle of your tenure committee or you're not liking a certain press. That can just be like other aspects too of list fit. I've worked with people who have said, if I don't publish with one of these three presses, I will not get tenure. Then those are your three presses. You kind of have a narrow field that hopefully makes your job easier. When things like that aren't a factor, when you have a lot of room to kind of figure out, you look at a press's list, you look at the things that we've been talking about. But I also wanted to use this question as a time to talk about like the editorial relationship you'll build with an editor. I think that, a lot of folks, and I can speak for my two colleagues on this, as editor, like we're trying really hard to work against like these ideas of gatekeeping as a negative, and think about how can we cultivate, how can we adjust like the power imbalance that can happen when like editors and publishers are making decisions that impact your career. So when I think about things like that, I think about making sure authors feel empowered to know like you can make a choice of who to publish with based on feeling like, oh, this editor, I didn't really think that we had a good working relationship, or I know my mentor says this press is great, but I feel like I had a better connection, or I'm liking what I see, the marketing support of this place better. Like those are all fair things to consider and factor in. And, we're expected to be like professionally courteous. And if you're finding like there's like weird things happen, and you're like, that seems like we're, the academy can tear you down, but you want an editor to build you up and be an advocate for you from day one for your project. So just thinking about those things as well, because you can publish with like a press where your mentor published and it was all well and great for them, and that might not serve you best. So within the, again, all things equal on paper, go with the place that you feel like you feel good about. And it's never a closed door if you decide not to move forward with like a press or an editor. Like, we understand it's relationships over years that you're talking to people. So what you decide for your first book may not be what you decide for a second book, for all hosts of reasons. And so we play the long game with folks, if that's helpful to hear.
I'm going to be the slightly contrarian person on the panel when it comes to this question. Because I believe prestige is probably king for most folks, and if it's not, then academia is probably not the place for you. And I think that that's just fair to put that out there, that that matters to people, because I do believe on the flip side of that, there can be a level of treatment and flippancy that some scholars do have depending on prestige. And I don't deal with this as much as I have earlier in my career, but other editors, we do talk about this of like, yeah, we were having this great relationship for like 6 months or even a year. And then they're like, well, I talked to my chair and they said this place isn't prestigious enough. And like, I get that that is important to you, but I don't necessarily know if that's the best way to relate to people because it does hurt feelings and it can be mean. Or folks who I know, we had a great relationship for a year and always responsive and always talking, and then you get the contract offer and I don't even get the courtesy of an email letting you know you're going elsewhere perhaps, or you're exploring your options. Or like there's people where I'm like, oh, they heard from option one, that's why I'm not even like, that's why it's like F me. Like, and no, that's not a good thing, I think, when we're talking about the art of building relationships with people, especially people who are in transient positions such as editors. Like I said, I do talk to folks and people do remember that treatment on the other side of it as well. And there are people, I have been treated in such a way once it was obvious that this wasn't where they needed to be or wanted to be, that sometimes it sticks in the back of your mind. And I think that it's important to have that conversation too, because I think that is a conversation that editors do have amongst themselves on the ground, and it can matter. And it's an issue because it happens enough that it's not just rogue academics are talking about kind of a culture around prestige and how people do that in the world over there.
I wonder too if some of this stems from, on both sides, just not talking enough to each other, right? In a more, I know something authors are often don't know how much they should be communicating with acquisitions editors. They worry about communicating too much or revealing too much or communicating too less, or not doing it, basically not doing it right, whatever right is supposed to mean in that context. And I think what all of you have been saying in various ways is to make that communication paramount to the way that you engage with any acquisitions editor, even if you don't end up publishing with them, right? So kind of communicating professionally, communicating honestly, being upfront about your needs, about what you bring to the table, about and acknowledging a publisher's needs and what they bring to the table, and just kind of foregrounding that from day one, even in casual relationships or casual conversations, all the way through to publication and beyond. So I don't know, maybe that's a little Pollyanna-ish, but I do think that a lot of this kind of, some of it at least, can come down to communication.
I mean, I definitely agree. If you communicate upfront about what your tenure pressure is, like what your other presses you're talking to, like at least I can, moderate my feelings about how good I feel about, landing a project or things like that. But also you do want to work with an editor who you do, as far as something that you want to weigh, like you do feel like you can communicate with, right? Like I've talked to authors who it's like, oh, I'm so bashful about telling my editor that I'm late. I'm like, just tell them, like, don't be bashful about it. But sometimes you don't form that relationship, and that's a bummer. Like I definitely try to tell people to be transparent with their editors and communicate with them.
I'm gonna push back just a little bit on this because I think as someone, I've worked at presses of very different levels of prestige in a short amount of time, to the point where I have worked with the same author at a very different place, and the behavior can be very different based off of some of those things. It is I I sometimes say I was treated better as an assistant at UNC than I've been treated as a full editor at Illinois, sometimes by the exact same person. And there is something to it, I do believe, there that's worth examining.
So it looks like we have some great questions in the Q&A that kind of, I think, link up to some of these things. One person is asking about the kind of audience question that I think Mike was talking about a little bit earlier. As a scholar, I mostly speak to scholarly audiences, but my book has the potential for academic crossover or trade, which, Dawn, that's something that you were mentioning as well. So hoping to have a wider reach. And so this person's question is, how do they know whether that's realistic or not? And then how to communicate that with an acquisitions editor, either in the book proposal, but also just in kind of conversations with folks at conferences or wherever.
Actually, I think this is one of those things where collaboration is key, because if you express what you think your audience is in discussions with your editor in a proposal, and we have questions or we disagree, like that's a really productive point of conversation. I get a lot of proposals where they're like, and I'm hoping for a crossover audience. And then I read the sample chapters and they're like incredibly scholarly. And so then it becomes a point where I can say, okay, like we have a problem to be solved. You've like identified like this potential audience, and this is how your writing style is going to not really reach that audience. So do we reconceptualize and refine your audience perception and projection, or do we work on getting those chapters to where they need to be to meet that? And I would say when you're kind of conceptualizing and articulating your audience, like precision is key. Like someone, I don't know, it was very recent, someone said there's like not really a general reader, and I was like, you're right, like I read generally some topics, but not everything interests me. And so thinking about it, is it educational practitioners, is it like, I mean, even if you were say like NPR listeners, like which ones, so trying to be like really specific, you can have that crossover audience, but which segment of it, and thinking through things like that. So how do you know if it's realistic or not? Like thinking about like who you're in discussion with. A lot of like scholar activists will say like the communities I've been working with will be interested in it, and that's a very finite and identifiable like number of communities, so that kind of thing. And then if you're unrealistic, like your editor's going to have an open dialogue to see if we can like kind of retool and make sure that you understand how the press would be positioning the book based on how the material we have of it.
I want to double down on having a conversation and collaboration with your editor, because crossover and academic trade means something very different at almost every press, I would say. From a numbers perspective, when someone says to me, just to put the numbers out there for folks, this has a crossover audience, that means I need to be able to move 600 to 1,000 copies of this within 3 years. That's a different number elsewhere, but that is ours. That's what, so kind of having again, a data point to attach that to. So then we have to ask, are there actually, because if I want to sell it to 600 to 1,000 people, then that means it has to get its eyes on that many more people, maybe sometimes even 2 or 3 or 5 times return on investment from that. And like I said, that's very different depending on the press that you're at. And so having that conversation with your editor about what your expectations are so they can communicate exactly what they can do when you're kind of conceptualizing, putting together the proposal is a fantastic idea.
I mean, I think it's a good idea to be hopeful that you can reach certain audiences, but that's more of a opening the conversation to that, right? And putting it on our radar so we can talk about, like Dawn said, it's often about like, this is really dense, like people aren't going to be able to hang with this. Like, okay, then you're losing this other audience that you might be interested in, right? So there's balance there. And yeah, like when I get those proposals, oftentimes I'll be like, let's do a Zoom call, right? Like, we got to talk this out, because is not productive for me to like respond on email and be like, no, that's not your audience, or like, I'm not sure about this audience. It's like really like, okay, but if you want that audience, like, what are you thinking? Are you going to revise this way? Like things like that. So it's chatting out is really helpful for that.
There's also a review of the profile of the scholar, and not like, do a lot of folks know you, but are you in the best vehicles to be knowable? Do you go to conferences in your space? The social media thing, I go back and forth about. I think I might have said something a few years ago that's different than what I think now about social media presence. I almost now say no social media presence is better than bad social media presence, is what I would say. But again, are you a vibrant self-promoter? There are people who they want to trade audience, but they don't want to get in front of a general audience and talk about their work. Well, like the profile, like the personality of the scholar can also matter when it comes to the writing. Because if you don't want to do any of those things, then to Don's point, the writing has to be that much better to compensate for all of that too.
One of the other questions that was put in the Q&A is, I think, a classic one. We get this a ton. I'm sure you get this as well. But it's an oldie but goodie. Do you have a general rule for evaluating how much of a book can be previously published in journal articles or some other format such that your press would still be willing to include it in the book version that they accept?
I recommend no more than 10% of your book should appear previously anywhere. So I would say if you are reprinting or really kind of revising one chapter, you're not going to hear anything from me for the most part. When we start talking about 2 and definitely 3 chapters have appeared in some other context, then we do have an issue with promotion. Again, these are oftentimes dissertation projects anyway. So how much of this has been fleshed out in front of people for them to consume? I always say when we talk about the world we live in, I always say I'm interested in knowledge production as a commercialized endeavor. So it does matter. And if you're trying to ship this book, there are people who are going to look and say, well, we have access to so many of the ideas in these other fashions. What is then the purpose of selling it, especially if we're talking about selling to a library market, which is where a lot of scholarly projects have to find some type of hold. And if you are, because that's the reason for not doing so much republishing in the book, is that, again, that material already exists. And for people who are looking to purchase it, you have to give them a reason. Why would they give you anywhere between $24.99 and $32.95, whatever the swing might be? Why would they do that? Why would they give us money in hand to do it if so much of it already exists? And so thinking about it from that way, like I would say, your money idea, save it for your book. Like your money idea should be your money chapter in your book. And that can be hard to do. I understand, as people have to write and get something published in the context of trying to get their 3rd-year review and tenure underway.
I'd pretty similar here. Like 1 chapter, totally fine. 2, like, oftentimes those 2 chapters are so much transformed from what they were in the journal article that like I have little worry. But yeah, I think 1 or 2 is usually fine for me.
A journal article is usually like half a chapter. And so if you're at 1 or 2, it's probably around like that 10%, more than 20% for having a conversation. It's like, there is a generation where they could publish their entire book as piecemeal and come to a press and we would publish it. And those days are no more for all the reasons that Dominique talked about.
One of the questions that was posted in the chat is a really nice kind of flip on something about the prestige question that we were talking about earlier. So we were talking about the prestige of a press and authors evaluating that in making their decisions. But this person is asking, do publishers themselves care about the quote unquote prestige of the university or institution that the author is at? And how does that kind of play a role in acquisitions?
I do not, and I think most of us do not. I think that we publish people who are independent scholars or community colleges or at all sorts of institutions, have left academia but are still writing great books. I would say one thing we do consider is something, Donnie, about profile. So if you have an apparatus within your university that pushes out lots of media when people publish, that might just mean we make different decisions about publishing the book. Like maybe we print more copies from the get-go. So it's not a matter of how we base a decision to acquire the book or to sign it or to move forward to peer review and those sorts of things. It just might impact some of the decisions we make along the way of like, oh, well, this author has a platform and is likely to sell more books, so we will print more copies of it at the beginning, or marketing might have different ideas for how to handle some of the way they pitch it to the world. But again, like at the end of the day, like we're not concerned about prestige when we're evaluating the scholarly merit of the book. It's just kind of how we might tweak the decisions about a publishing strategy.
I agree. It does influence what we think, the kinds of resources you might have too, right? So like find the time to write, to be able to get funding for your index so you're not doing it yourself or putting it on your credit card, right? Like that's going to impact how, sometimes I know I can push an author because they're on sabbatical, right? And sometimes I'm like, well, they have a full-time job. Like we're just going to have to like play this out, and they're going to write when they can. So it impacts what I know of your writing process a bit. But yeah, as long as your profile does not necessarily include your university affiliation.
Yeah. I would say I almost try to even not prejudice myself unknowingly. So I usually try to like not look at the CV or anything like that until I'm getting ready to pitch the project. I really like to evaluate the merit of the scholarship on its own. And so, like I said, I won't even consider your CV until I'm taking it for to ask for a contract from my team for that reason. What it can signal to, and I don't know if prestige is the right word, but the type of institution one is at can say a lot about how much the writing is valued by either the institution or the people at it. It says something about the community of folks you have around you, folks who are at institutions that don't privilege or prioritize writing and conducting research. Oftentimes, a lot of that developmental work then has to happen at the press, right? Those books usually take a little longer to review because more people have to look at it. They're usually not as ready to go out the gate. I'm usually paying a slightly more. Sometimes what often will happen is I'll get a reader who might say, like this book needs a lot more digging in than I expect it to. And so then I have to compensate that person for that. So like it can become from again a resource um perspective. I do try to balance it all because I wish I could have that level of resources to put on all of the projects, but alas, I can't. And so I might think about it from there because there, like I said, I don't know what the cause of that is, but there is some type of correlation is what I've begun to experience. And I publish, as Dawn said, I publish independent scholars, I publish folks who work at community colleges, and I publish folks who work, research one and sometimes even Ivy institutions. And that can be the biggest difference.
Another question for the chat asks about where to look for data points on how many books are sold or how many books are expected to be sold. Dom, you were mentioning some really helpful specific numbers, and I think this person is wondering where can they find that kind of information without emailing you directly.
You won't find it anywhere without asking us. In the beginning of first conversations, like I said, I don't, much to my marketing team's chagrin, I don't think about print runs when I acquire books in the beginning. Are you crazy? But it's something if it's not something that necessarily all editors share. All publishers don't share that information with scholars. It's part of my process and practice. If we have that type of relationship, we can have that conversation, but that's not going to be evaluated at the beginning. But most presses, we've ran some type of profit loss on your book when we talk about bringing it forward for contracting. And if you would like an idea of what the press thinks about the sales capabilities, that would be the best time to have a conversation with an editor and see what they do share with you. Very few are going to tell you what the projected probably print run is at that point. But like I said, those are kind of the general numbers of what we're talking about when we use those terms.
Somebody else asked a question that I think is a really nice kind of opening is, what do you think first-time authors should be asking acquisitions editors that they don't?
If you have the question, that's the one you should ask. And you shouldn't be afraid that we're going to think it's silly or that it's not good enough. Like that's literally what we're here for. And we're spending years of our lives trying to be able to answer those questions to the best of our ability. And we're like so happy to do it. So I think it's one of those things where it's like the worst question is the one you don't ask. But really, I think people um, there's not one magic question because everyone's coming with a different set of circumstances. And so by the questions that we get asked, it helps us to know how we can best support people. Because if I start talking about marketing and you're like, whoa, I'm going to lose my job without an advanced contract. Well, okay, we should focus on contracts then. So I think that would probably be my best advice.
The one question that I think that authors would be better benefited from asking is what are their expectations for you when it comes to promotion, your own promotion of the book can be something to think about. And the other one I would ask, thinking about whatever your next project is, what are their option clauses? What do those look like? Do they actually, is there an expectation that your next book come back to them? These are again about these like long tail things. Is this going to actually be in the legal document that you sign? What does that mean to the individual press? I've been at presses where the option clause means we just kind of want to know what you're doing. But I have some where folks say it's a nightmare, like they want to see the manuscript, the next one. And you should know that going in when it talks about, again, that long-term relationship building with either a press or an editor. I've also had scholars ask me, where are you going to be in 3 to 5 years? Do they know? That might be important for you as somebody who you come to a press working with an editor and you sign that proposal. That book's not ready for another 3 years, even perhaps, and your editor doesn't work there anymore. And then the priorities of the ship press maybe change. And again, you don't have the personal relationship with that editor. And there's some folks that I might really say, if you that worried if I'm gonna be here in such and such years, then maybe we should hold off on making a formal arrangement. And I think scholars would be best benefited by asking those questions. Like I said, there's no inappropriate question to ask. And I do get asked that by folks. Not as often as I think I probably should.
I'm seeing several questions that address contracts in various ways. But I think one of the common themes here is, when is a contract offered in the process, and when should authors kind of expect that, and expect to, enter that the beginning of that process? And is there anything that you would recommend that authors inquire about or avoid inquiring about in the contract negotiation process?
Yeah, I mean, contracts, I feel like I sign contracts at all different points, right? Like sometimes it's way early and the book's not going to be ready for 4 years. And sometimes it's like right at the end, right before it's going to press committee. So after peer review. So um, when it works for you, when you need a contract, let us know. Like we're often going to put the contract on the table because we want to get your commitment and we would love to, solidify that. But yeah, I don't think there's a right, like perfect time for a contract. I do think I usually tell people with their proposal and sample chapters getting an advance contract, maybe like 2 years, a year and a half until the manuscript is ready is kind of when I start thinking about maybe a good time to put it under advance contract, but that's just kind of a vague idea there. And then the one thing about the contract that I would say don't do is to send it to like your lawyer brother or uncle or something like that. It's just, we all have pretty templated contracts. There's very few points in those contracts that are like truly negotiable. And so like getting a completely annotated marked up contract back from us, we're just going to say no to most of it. So like, be realistic about what you actually want to pay attention to in the contract.
Things that you can negotiate in a contract for the most part is your delivery date. You can negotiate that. You're going to be able to probably negotiate the number of free copies you can get. Most presses offer 10 is usually, like that's usually what I've offered at most presses I've worked at. So you can negotiate that. You can negotiate when your language rights revert back to you, which means when can I start shopping to translate on my own? Because what I like to tell folks what a contract with a press means is that you have relinquished the rights to your book and you will be paid a royalty for that. And that's very serious work. And I think that we as publishers can do a better job of communicating what that means. That means nothing about your book, a conversation about it from a legal perspective, can happen without the press once you've put the press in place. And so knowing what that means, I've had folks where folks go to the mat because they're like, well, I want to shop this for film rights. And again, all of that has to come through the press and through our rights manager once you signed an agreement with us. And I think a lot of people aren't necessarily I think, again, there should be a little more explicit conversation about what that contract truly does mean for you and what you can and can't negotiate out. And sometimes you can have rights revert back to you. Some folks do get a license instead of signing over copyright. It does very rarely happen. Very rarely is that going to happen for a first-time book author where you're going to get a licensing agreement as opposed to a copyright agreement where the press owns it. But these are things that you can ask for.
Okay, so it looks like we are coming up on time. So I do want to thank all of you for joining us today and answering these fantastic questions. I know we didn't get to everybody's, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to send out some more explanation for some of the topics that we didn't get a chance to cover yet. I do hope that all of you are coming away with some new ideas, some insights, and hopefully some inspiration for researching and hopefully finding the right publisher for your first book. I do want to say a huge thank you to our amazing speakers for sharing your expertise and your enthusiasm for first books and your honesty. I think it's been really invaluable for folks in the audience who are navigating that first book journey. The recording for the session will be emailed to everyone who's registered by the end of this week, so keep an eye on your inbox for that. And finally, don't forget to join us for the next webinar in this series, which is Crafting a Winning First Book Proposal. And that's coming up on November 10th. And it features editors from the University of Michigan Press, Columbia University Press, and MIT Press. And you can register for that on our website at ideasonfire.net. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for speaking. I hope this was really helpful, and I look forward to seeing hopefully some of you in our November session. See you all next time.
Thank you for having us, and thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
See y'all around. Don't be a stranger. Say hello.